Yoon Ki-tae and Emily Maddison. Two lives separated by the thickness of a bulletproof window. He was the architect of the city's sins. She was the girl who swept the dust they left behind. He was a name whispered in terror. She was a face the world habitually looked through. The world looked at him and stepped aside. The world looked at her and looked away. But something happened that no one expected. The man with all the power and all the money decided to become a ghost. He gave it all up, every black card, every soldier, every signal of the monster he had become, because he was looking for something more valuable than anything his empire could offer. And the only person who had it was the last person the world would ever have chosen. This is their story. And it doesn't go the way you think it will. There were exactly 3 people in the city who knew Yoon Ki-tae's real net worth, and 2 of them were currently in the concrete foundation of the Seoul Incheon Bridge. The third was his advisor, a man named Park who moved like a shadow and spoke in the clinical tones of a mortician. Park sat across from Ki-tae in the back of a rain-slicked black sedan, idling in the neon-drenched sprawl of Gangnam, and said for what must have been the 100th time that year, "The chairman expects a merger. The Han family is offering their eldest daughter. It solidifies the ports. It secures the north." Ki-tae didn't look up from the small, jagged scar on his knuckle. He was 35 years old. He controlled legitimate shipping holdings worth north of $400 million and illegitimate operations that tripled that number. He had a jaw like a hatchet, shoulders like a fortress, and eyes the color of gunmetal that made grown men stammer when he looked at them directly. He was, by any external measure, a man who had everything, and he had. That was the problem. He'd had Hannah, the heiress who'd pledged her soul to him right up until she realized his father's succession plan was under threat, at which point she'd vanished into a marriage of convenience before the ink on the headline was dry. He'd had Min-ji, the actress whose devotion was perfectly calibrated to the size of the diamond he placed on her finger every anniversary. And then there was Sora, the attorney, the one he actually trusted, the one he'd sat across from at a candlelit dinner in Jeju and told his darkest secrets to. And then he'd found the recording device taped beneath the table and the federal task force she'd been feeding for 11 months. Sora had been the last one 3 years ago. Since then, Yoon Ki-tae had sealed himself inside his empire, like a man walling himself into a mausoleum. He had decided, with the cold certainty that governed every hit he ordered, that love was a transaction, and transactions could be gamed. "The Han family won't wait forever," Park said, his voice a low hum against the rhythm of the rain. "Then let them find another buyer," Ki-tae replied. He watched the rain blur the glass, Manhattan-like skyscrapers bleeding into gray light, and he felt a thought, a reckless, strange plan, finally snap into place. He was going to find out if it was possible for someone to love him with nothing. Not the man with the neck tattoo that signaled death, or the man with the army of soldiers, but just him. "I'm going away, Park. For 3 months. No contact. No money. No name." "This is insanity," Park said 2 weeks later, standing in the doorway of a crumbling studio apartment in a forgotten corner of the city. The linoleum was stained, and the faucet dripped a metronome of brown water into a rusted sink. "You are the most powerful man east of the border, and you're going to live like this?" Ki-tae was sitting on a thin mattress on the floor, lacing up a pair of thrift store boots with cracked soles. He wore a dark green polo and a black zip-up hoodie he'd bought for $10. He had removed his Patek Philippe and locked it in a safe. In its place was a Casio digital watch from a gas station that cost $8. "No one sees the help, Park," Ki-tae said, and for the first time in years, his gunmetal eyes looked alive. "That's the whole point." Within 48 hours, Yoon Ki-tae ceased to exist. In his place was Yoon, an unremarkable day laborer who got a job at a small, failing café on the outskirts of the district. The café was a fluorescent-lit box that smelled of burnt beans and damp cardboard, run by a man who treated his staff like fixtures. Ki-tae spent his nights mopping floors and his days taking the bus, experiencing for the first time what it felt like to be a speck. The way people stepped around him on the sidewalk without adjusting their stride. The way customers spoke past him as if he were a piece of furniture. He tried the experiment. He tried dating. He created a profile on a free app, using a photo of himself in his hoodie, listing his job as laborer. The results were a surgical strike to his ego. One woman unmatched him the moment he mentioned he didn't own a car. Another met him for coffee, saw his $8 watch in his rough hands, and suddenly remembered an emergency 10 minutes in. He was starting to understand, with a clarity that felt like a blade, exactly how much of his previous life had been proximity to his wallet. Then, on a Tuesday in the teeth of a November gale, he saw Emily Maddison. He was sitting on a bench outside a laundromat, waiting for his clothes to dry, eating a gas station sandwich. Across the street, a white car with a dented hood sat stalled in the pouring rain. A woman stepped out, and the first thing Ki-tae noticed was the dark red sweater, simple, worn, and pilling at the cuffs. She didn't look like the women in Gangnam. Her dark hair was long and wet, clinging to her face as she wrestled with the car's hood. The world ignored her. A man in a tailored coat sidestepped the puddle she was standing in without even a glance. A group of teenagers laughed as they passed, making a comment about her clunker car. Emily didn't look for a savior. She leaned into the wind, her face flushed from the cold, her soft features set in a look of quiet, weary determination. She had learned that unsolicited help usually came with a price tag, so she didn't ask. Something in the way she didn't expect to be seen made Ki-tae stand up. He crossed the street, his hoodie soaking through in seconds. "That doesn't look great," he said, stopping by the car. She looked up, her dark brown eyes wide and wary. She took in his light stubble, his wet black hair slicked back, and his cracked boots. She didn't see a billionaire. She didn't see a monster. She saw a man who looked just as tired as she was. "The radiator hose decided to quit," she said, her voice a soft thread against the wind. She pushed a strand of wet hair behind her ear, her lips parted in a slight, uncertain breath.
"I'm Emily."
"I'm Yoon," he replied. He spent the next hour in the rain with her, helping her move boxes of old books from her trunk to the curb while they waited for a tow truck she couldn't really afford. She told him about her cafe, how it was more than a business, how it was a place for the neighborhood kids to feel safe. She didn't flirt. She didn't calculate his worth. She simply talked to him as a person talking to another person. "Thank you for staying," she said when the truck finally arrived. People don't usually stay. The word landed between them with a weight that had nothing to do with cars. Ki-tae watched her drive away, the taillights of her dented car disappearing into the gray light. He stood on the wet sidewalk, his Casio watch ticking against his wrist, and realized that 90-second conversation was the most real thing that had happened to him in a decade. He was Yoon, the invisible laborer. She was Emily, the forgotten girl. And in the heart of the storm, the man who owned the dark realized he had finally found something that wasn't for sale. The rain in Gangnam didn't just fall. It descended like a heavy, liquid curtain, blurring the neon geometry of the city into a smear of electric pinks and cold blues. Inside the back of the armored sedan, the world was reduced to the scent of expensive, hand-stitched leather and the clinical, pressurized silence that only extreme wealth can buy. Yoon Ki-tae sat motionless, his silhouette a dark, jagged edge against the soft glow of the city passing outside his window. He was 35 years old, and he was the undisputed architect of an empire that breathed through the ports and bled through the back alleys of Seoul. To the world, he was a predator of singular focus. To his enemies, he was a name spoken only in past tense. But to himself, as he watched the distorted reflection of his own face in the glass, he looked like a man who had been buried alive in a tomb of his own making. Across from him sat Park, a man whose loyalty was a biological function, as reliable and cold as the beating of a heart. Park had been his shadow for a decade, the only person permitted to witness the quiet arithmetic of Ki-tae's power. He held a tablet, the screen illuminating his sharp, hawkish features in a pale, sickly light. "The chairman is losing patience, Ki-tae," Park said, his voice a low, mechanical hum. "The merger with the Han family isn't just a business arrangement, it's a treaty. Their daughter is 24, Sorbonne educated, and her father controls the northern logistics. It's the final piece. It solidifies everything you've built." Ki-tae didn't answer. He was looking at his hands, large, capable hands that had moved pieces across a board for years until there were no players left to challenge him. He thought of the women who had occupied the seat Park now sat in. He thought of Hannah, who had whispered promises of eternity until she saw a dip in his father's quarterly earnings and realized the throne might be wobbly. He thought of Minji, whose affection had been a perfectly calibrated performance, rising and falling with the carat count of the jewels he gifted her. And then there was Sora. Sora, the attorney with the soft laugh and the eyes that seemed to see right through the iron of his reputation. He had actually believed her. He had sat across from her at a candlelit table in Jeju, peeling back the layers of the monster to show her the man, only to find the recording device taped beneath the mahogany and the federal task force she'd been feeding for nearly a year. Sora had been the final lesson. She was the one who had calcified his cynicism into something closer to bone than belief. Since that night in Jeju 3 years ago, Ki-tae had sealed himself inside his empire, like a man walling himself into a mausoleum of gold. He had decided, with the same cold certainty that governed the shipments in the harbor, that love was nothing more than a high-end transaction. Every smile was an invoice. Every touch was a contract. And the not knowing, the gnawing, persistent hunger to know if there was anything left of him worth seeing without the $900 million shield, was eating him alive. I said no, Park, Ki-tae said finally, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. The Hans won't wait. In this world, you are either expanding or you are being consumed. You need a foundation that isn't built solely on fear. Fear is a transaction I understand, Ki-tae replied, turning his gunmetal eyes toward his advisor. The intensity of his gaze made Park pause, a microscopic hesitation that signaled the conversation had hit a wall. I am tired of being the highest bidder for my own life. I look at these women and I see accountants. I look at my soldiers and I see employees. I want to know who Yoon Ki-tae is when the money stops talking. He leaned back, the decision snapping into place with the finality of a deadbolt. It was a plan so reckless, so fundamentally insane for a man in his position that it made his pulse thrum with a forgotten energy. He was going to strip it all away. He was going to become a speck in the very city he owned. I'm going away, he murmured, almost to himself. For 3 months. No contact. No name. No black card. I want to be a ghost, Park. I want to see if a ghost can still feel the sun, or if the only reason people look at me is because I'm standing in front of a pile of gold. This is a death wish, Park whispered, his composure finally cracking. You have enemies in every district. If you walk into the streets without your armor, they will tear you apart. If someone recognizes me, then the experiment fails. But no one sees the help, Park. No one looks at the man mopping the floor or the laborer waiting for the bus. We built this world to look through people like that. I'm going to use that invisibility as my fortress. The following weeks were a surgical deconstruction of a life. Ki-tae watched as Park built him a secondary existence from the ground up. His name would be Yoon, 35. A day laborer with no credit, no car, and no history. He rented a studio apartment in a district so neglected the streetlights were merely suggestions. It was a fluorescent-lit box with stained linoleum and a kitchen faucet that dripped a rhythmic, brown metronome into a rusted sink. He bought his clothes from a thrift store, jeans that didn't fit quite right, a black zip-up hoodie with a fraying hem, and work boots with cracked soles that bit into his heels. On the final night, Ki-tae stood in his penthouse, a sprawling glass cathedral overlooking the Han River. He looked at his Patek Philippe, a masterpiece of horology that cost more than most men earned in a decade. He took it off and locked it in a safe deposit box, replacing it with a Casio digital watch he'd bought at a gas station for $8. He grew out a jagged stubble that hid the sharp, hatchet-like line of his jaw. He stopped the meticulous grooming that signaled his status. When he looked in the mirror, the Korean Mafia boss was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he had been worn down by the quiet, grinding machinery of poverty. 3 months, Ki-tae said, standing in the doorway of the dingy Kearney-equivalent studio, his voice echoing in the empty, cold space. No contact unless the empire is literally burning to the ground. Park stood in the hallway, looking at the man he had served for 10 years. For the first time, he saw something in Ki-tae's face that wasn't calculated or cold. It was a spark of something almost alive, the desperate, terrifying energy of a man who had been drowning in still water and had finally decided to swim. And if you find what you're looking for,
Park asked.
if you find someone who sees the man without the money? Ki-tae adjusted the strap of the cheap grocery bag he was holding, his posture relaxing into a grounded, ordinary stillness. Then I'll know I haven't spent my life building a tomb for a man who is already dead. He stepped into the hallway, the heavy steel door clicking shut behind him, sealing away the boss and the billionaire. As he walked down the dimly lit stairs, the $8 watch ticked against his wrist, a humble, relentless reminder that the clock on his old life had stopped. He stepped out into the cold, midnight air of the district, a man without a name, a ghost entering the world to see if anyone would bother to acknowledge his existence. He had spent his life being a monster people feared. Now, he was going to see if he was a person someone could respect. The transition from Yoon Ki-tae to the man simply known as Yoon did not happen in a single moment of dramatic flair, but in 1,000 microscopic surrenders of dignity. In the penthouse, every movement Ki-tae made had been curated by an army of subordinates. Here, in the dim, flickering hallway of a Kearney tenement, he was responsible for the very air he breathed. The $8 Casio watch on his wrist felt like a lead weight, its plastic strap pinching his skin with a cheap, synthetic tenacity that his Patek Philippe never would have dared. It was a digital metronome for a life that was now measured in minutes worked rather than millions moved. As he stepped out of the heavy steel door of his previous existence, the silence of the district swallowed him, a stark contrast to the buzzing, high-stakes static of the Gangnam boardroom. He was no longer the architect of the city's sins. He was a man with $20 in his pocket and a stomach that was beginning to realize it no longer had a private chef on standby. He spent the first 48 hours in a state of sensory shock. The apartment smelled of damp plaster and the lingering, greasy ghost of 1,000 cheap meals cooked by the tenants who had come before him. The linoleum floor was cold enough to bite through his thin socks, and the mattress, a stained, lumpy rectangle he'd bought from a liquidator, offered no sanctuary for a back accustomed to Italian linens. He sat on the edge of that mattress, lacing up the thrift store boots, and felt the first true wave of his own invisibility. In his old life, his presence in a room was an atmospheric event. Men stood straighter, women adjusted their jewelry, and the very temperature seemed to drop. Now, as he walked down to the local bodega to buy a loaf of bread that was 3 days past its prime, he realized that people didn't just ignore him. They looked through him as if he were a pane of glass in an abandoned building. He stood in line at the Fresh Mart, the fluorescent lit box that would become his new theater of operations. The manager, a man named Gilroy whose sweat seemed to be composed entirely of nervous caffeine, didn't even look at Ki-tae's face when he handed him the polyester vest. Gilroy saw a pair of broad shoulders, a jagged stubble, and a man who looked desperate enough to work the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift without complaining about the lack of benefits. "You're the new guy, right?" "Yoon," Gilroy barked, his eyes fixed on a clipboard. "Stocking is in the back. Aisle 4. Don't break the jars. If you're slow, you're gone. This isn't a charity." Ki-tae took the vest, the fabric feeling thin and abrasive against his skin. For a split second, the boss within him, the man who could have had Gilroy's entire life dismantled with a single phone call, flared to life. His jaw tightened and his gunmetal eyes narrowed into a lethal focus. But then he felt the plastic strap of the Casio watch, and the sensation grounded him. He wasn't a king here.
He was a speck.
He gave a short, stiff nod and walked toward the back, his cracked boots squeaking on the polished concrete. The work was a rhythmic, soul-deadening exercise in insignificance. He spent 8 hours lifting cardboard boxes, slicing through packing tape, and arranging cans of soup with a precision that was entirely unappreciated. In the Gangnam office, his decisions affected international shipping lanes. Here, his greatest challenge was ensuring the labels faced forward. He watched his fellow workers, men and women with hollowed-out eyes and a posture that suggested they were carrying the weight of the entire world on their hunched shoulders. They didn't talk to him. They didn't even acknowledge his existence beyond a grunt when he moved a pallet out of their way. He was experiencing the language of silence from the other side, and it was a cold, clinical education in the reality of the forgotten. The most devastating realization came during his first bus ride home. He sat near the back, his hoodie pulled low, the scent of cardboard and floor cleaner clinging to his clothes. He watched the city blur past the window, a Manhattan-like skyline that he knew held the keys to his real power. But on this bus, he was just another weary body taking up space. A woman sat next to him, her eyes glued to her phone, and when her bag brushed against his arm, she didn't apologize. She didn't even flinch. To her, he wasn't a threat or a person of interest. He was a piece of the bus's interior, as human as the plastic seat. He thought of Sora, the attorney who had betrayed him. He realized now that her love had been a performance designed to navigate his status. She had seen the boss and treated him accordingly. But this woman on the bus and Gilroy, and the teenagers who laughed as they walked past him on the sidewalk, they were seeing the shell. And the shell was invisible. The not knowing that had been eating him alive was being replaced by a sharp, jagged truth. The world's respect was a garment you purchased, not something you were born with. On his third night, he stood in the kitchen of his studio apartment, staring at the brown water dripping from the faucet. He was bone-tired, his muscles aching in a way that exercise never could replicate. He reached for the grocery bag he'd brought home, a single gas station sandwich, and a bottle of water. He ate standing up, the silence of the room pressing in on him like a physical weight. He looked at his hands, now stained with the grime of the warehouse and the ink of the packing labels. He was 35, he was a billionaire, and he was currently the most unremarkable man in the district. He found himself checking the Casio watch every few minutes, waiting for the time to pass, waiting for the shift to end, waiting for the experiment to provide a result that didn't feel like a slow death. He had stripped away the gold, but he hadn't yet found the sun. He had only found the cold, hard floor of the world. IT was in this state of absolute, grinding anonymity that he began to understand the moral of the dragon. In his previous life, isolation had been a luxury, a choice he made to protect his secrets. Here, isolation was a sentence. It was the feeling of standing in a crowded room and knowing that if you disappeared tomorrow, the only person who would notice would be the manager wondering why the soup cans weren't stocked. He leaned against the stained kitchen counter, the hum of the old refrigerator the only sound in the room. He wasn't Yoon Ki-tae anymore. He was the man who cleaned up the mess. He was the ghost in the machine. And as the morning light began to bleed through the grime on his window, he realized that the mausoleum of gold he had left behind wasn't just a place of wealth. It was a place where he at least had a name. Here, he was just a speck. And the speck was starting to feel the weight of the universe. He tightened the laces on his cracked boots, the synthetic snap of the Casio watch echoing in the stillness. He had shed the skin of a boss, and the new skin was raw, exposed, and entirely alone. He stepped out into the hallway, the smell of damp plaster greeting him like an old enemy, and began the walk to the bus stop. He had 30 days left in his experiment, and for the first time in his life, Yoon Ki-tae was truly afraid, not of his enemies, but of the possibility that the world was right. That without the money, there was nothing left to see. The transition from a man who commanded the tides of a criminal empire to a man who stocked soup cans had left Yoon Ki-tae in a state of perpetual, low-level exhaustion that felt heavier than any tactical gear he had ever worn. It was a Tuesday in the teeth of a November gale, the kind of day where the sky over the district was the color of an old bruise and the rain came down in jagged, icy sheets. Ki-tae was sitting on a wooden bench outside a 24-hour laundromat on Bergen Avenue, the vibration of the industrial dryers humming through the wood and into his spine. He was wearing his black zip-up hoodie, the hem fraying against his thighs, and his $8 Casio watch was a cold, plastic circle against his wrist. He was eating a gas station sandwich, the bread dry and the filling indistinguishable, watching the world through the steam rising from a nearby sewer grate. In his old life, a storm like this would have been viewed through the triple-paned glass of a penthouse, accompanied by a glass of vintage scotch and the silent, reverent service of his staff. Now, the rain was a physical adversary. It soaked through the shoulders of his hoodie and made his cracked leather boots feel like lead weights. He felt smaller than he had ever felt, not just physically but existentially. He was Yoon now, a man whose presence in the world was so negligible that people stepped around him on the sidewalk without even adjusting their stride. He was experiencing the language of silence from the underside, and it was a cold, clinical education in the reality of the forgotten. Across the street, a white car with a dented hood and a rusted quarter panel sat stalled in the middle of a deepening puddle. It looked like a relic held together by nothing but prayer and rust. The driver's side door creaked open, and a woman stepped out into the deluge. The first thing Ki-tae noticed was the dark red sweater. It was a simple, knit thing, pilling at the cuffs and slightly oversized, looking as though it had been washed 100 times too many. Above it, her dark brown hair was long and wet, clinging to her face in messy, unstyled strands. She didn't look like the women Ki-tae was used to, the ones whose beauty was a curated weapon, sharp and expensive. This woman, Emily Maddison, had soft, round facial features that were currently flushed from the cold and a look in her wide, dark brown eyes that suggested she was mid-negotiation with a world that was winning. She walked to the front of the car and wrestled with the hood. It took 3 tries before the metal groaned and stayed open, releasing a pathetic, hissing cloud of steam that was instantly swallowed by the rain. She stood there for a moment, her lips slightly parted as if mid-sentence, staring at the engine with a look of quiet, weary uncertainty. A man in a tailored gray coat walked past her, his umbrella tilted to protect only himself, sidestepping the puddle she was standing in without even a glance. A group of teenagers in a passing bus laughed and pointed at her clunker, their voices muffled by the glass, but their intent clear. Emily didn't look up. She didn't shout for help, and she didn't look for a savior. She simply leaned into the wind, her brows gently raised in a look of resigned determination, and reached back into the car for a heavy cardboard box. In his previous life, Ki-tae would have watched this scene as a detached observer, if he noticed it at all. But as Yoon, the invisible man, he felt a strange, magnetic pull toward her struggle. He stood up, the dry sandwich left forgotten on the bench, and crossed the street. The rain hit him with a renewed ferocity, but he didn't feel the cold. He felt a sudden, sharp need to interact with someone who looked as tired as he was. "That doesn't look great," he said, stopping a few feet away from the car. Emily peered around the stack of boxes she was holding. Her eyes were wide, showing a flicker of confusion that quickly settled into a careful, wary attention. She took in his light stubble, his wet black hair, and the dark green polo shirt peeking out from beneath his hoodie. She didn't see the neck tattoo that signaled his history of violence. She saw a man who looked like he'd just spent 10 hours mopping a floor. "The radiator hose decided to quit," she said. Her voice was a soft, steady thread against the roar of the wind. "I think the car finally realized it's older than most of the kids in the neighborhood." "I can help with those," he said, gesturing to the boxes. She studied him for a long moment, the water dripping from her hair and onto her dark red sweater. It was an assessment unlike any he had ever received. When Hannah or Sora had looked at him, they were calculating the distance between his wallet and their desires. When Emily looked at him, she was deciding if he was safe. "The top one is lighter," she said finally, her voice lacking the performative sweetness he had grown to distrust. "It's mostly children's books."
I'm Emily.
"I'm Yoon," he replied, taking the box from her. For the next hour, they worked in the rain, moving boxes from her trunk to the porch of a small, struggling cafe 3 doors down. It was called the Madison Cup, and through the window, Ki-tae could see the same fluorescent-lit boxiness he encountered at Freshmart, but with a layer of warmth that suggested it was being held together by more than just plaster. As they moved, Emily talked. She told him about how she had been collecting these books for a neighborhood reading corner. She didn't ask what he did for a living, and she didn't ask why a man with his build was stocking shelves for minimum wage. She simply treated him as a peer. "Thank you, Yoon," she said when the last box was inside. She was shivering slightly now, her damp clothes clinging to her frame. She looked at him directly, her gaze focused and sincere. "Most people, they don't stay when it starts to rain. They find a reason to be somewhere else. I didn't have anywhere else to be, he said, and for the first time in 10 years, the words were absolutely true. The conversation lasted 90 seconds, but it was the most real thing that had happened to Yoon Ki-tae in a decade. There was no transaction here. She hadn't flirted. She hadn't tried to impress him with her pedigree. She hadn't looked at his Casio watch and adjusted her attitude. She had simply been a person in a storm, acknowledging another person in the same storm. As the tow truck finally arrived and Emily waved a final, weary goodbye, Ki-tae stood on the wet sidewalk and watched the taillights of her dented car disappear into the gray light. He felt the cold now, and the ache in his back, and the grime on his skin. But he also felt a strange, heavy peace. The mausoleum of gold was 3 districts away, but the invisible man had finally found something that wasn't for sale. Respect. Not the respect bought with blood and fear, but the kind given to a man who sits on a wet curb and stays when it starts to rain. He turned and began the walk to the bus stop, the $8 watch ticking against his wrist with a humble, relentless precision. He had shed the skin of a boss, and for the first time, the raw, exposed skin underneath was beginning to feel the sun through the rain. He had 30 days left in his experiment, but as he watched the bus pull up to the curb, Ki-tae realized he wasn't looking for a way back to the Gangnam penthouse. He was looking for the next Tuesday in November. The fluorescent lights of the Madison Cup hummed with a low-frequency fatigue that seemed to match the vibration in Yoon Ki-tae's own bones. It was a Thursday, the air outside heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and the ozone of an approaching storm. Inside, the café was a sanctuary of scuffed linoleum and the honest, bitter aroma of over-roasted coffee. Ki-tae sat at a small corner table, his large frame compressed into a chair that felt dangerously fragile beneath him. He was nursing a lukewarm cup of black coffee, the 79-cent gas station variety that Emily insisted on giving him for free, and watching her move behind the counter. She was wearing the dark red sweater again, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows as she reorganized a stack of children's books for the reading corner. She looked tired, her soft features shadowed by the relentless arithmetic of small business survival, yet there was a stubborn grace in the way she moved, a refusal to let the weight of the world bend her shoulders. For Ki-tae, these hours in the café had become the only time his mind wasn't performing an autopsy on his own cynicism. As Yoon, the invisible laborer, he had found a strange, pressurized peace. He spent his nights stocking shelves at Fresh Mart, his body becoming a machine of repetitive motion, and his days drifting through the district like a ghost. But in this room, under Emily's casual, respectful gaze, he felt a terrifyingly real sense of belonging. She didn't look at his neck tattoo and see a death sentence. She didn't look at his rough, scarred hands and see a weapon. She saw a man who stayed when it rained, and that simple recognition was more addictive than any power he had ever wielded in the Gangnam boardrooms. The peace broke at 4:14 p.m. It didn't shatter. It curdled. The bell above the door chimed, a sharp, tinny sound that usually signaled a neighborhood regular, but the air that followed the intruders into the room was cold and jagged. 3 men stepped inside, their presence instantly recalibrating the atmosphere of the café. They weren't soldiers of the elite syndicates Ki-tae governed. They were scavengers, low-level street predators who wore their desperation like cheap cologne. The leader was a man in his late 20s with a bleached blonde undercut and a leather jacket that was too shiny to be real. He moved with a practiced, twitchy bravado, his eyes darting around the room with a hunter's instinct for vulnerability. Ki-tae felt his inner dragon stir, a cold, lethal heat beginning to coil at the base of his spine. He didn't move. He kept his head down, his eyes fixed on the muddy surface of his coffee, but his peripheral vision locked onto the men with surgical precision. He knew this rhythm. He had orchestrated it 1,000 times from the top of the pyramid. This was the opening move of a protection racket, the tax collected by those who were too weak to build anything of their own. "Nice place you got here," the leader said, his voice a harsh, nasal rasp that cut through the quiet hum of the café. He didn't walk to the counter. He sauntered, his hand trailing along the backs of the chairs as if he were marking territory. He stopped at the reading corner, picking up a dog-eared copy of a picture book and letting it drop back onto the shelf with a dismissive thud. A bit quiet, though. Makes it hard to hear when someone's trying to do you a favor. Emily stood behind the counter, her hands resting on the laminate surface. Her knuckles were white, but her voice was steady, a resonant, disciplined hum that made Ki-tae's heart hammer against his ribs. The favors in this neighborhood usually come with an invoice I can't afford, Min-ho. I told you last week. The Madison Cup isn't part of your circuit. Things change, Emily, Min-ho replied, leaning over the counter until he was inches from her face. The district is getting crowded. Accidents happen. A kitchen fire here, a broken window there. It's a lot for a girl like you to handle alone. We're just offering a little stability. Professional insurance. Ki-tae's grip tightened on his coffee cup until the plastic groaned. The mask he had spent weeks perfecting, the unremarkable laborer, the invisible speck, was beginning to fracture. Every instinct he possessed, every year of training in the brutal governance of the underworld, screamed at him to rise. He could see the exact angle he would need to take to crush Min-ho's windpipe. He could calculate the 3 seconds it would take to disarm the 2 subordinates hovering by the door. His gunmetal eyes darkened, the lethal focus of the Mafia boss returning with a predatory intensity that made the shadows in the corner seem to deepen. But he stayed seated. This was the struggle of the invisible man. If he rose, the experiment died. If he became the monster, he lost the woman in the red sweater. Emily didn't know Yoon Ki-tae. She knew Yoon, the man who sat on wet curbs and listened to her talk about library sales. If he revealed the iron in his blood, the respect she gave him, the only real thing he had found in a decade, would be replaced by the same fear that had turned his previous life into a mausoleum. He had to watch her armor crack and do nothing, a penance that felt more agonizing than any physical blow. Min-ho reached out, his fingers hovering near a strand of Emily's dark hair. Think about it, Emily. We'll be back on Monday. If the envelope isn't ready, the coffee might start tasting like smoke. He turned to leave, his eyes finally landing on the large man in the corner hoodie. For a split second, Ki-tae allowed his gaze to meet Min-ho's. It wasn't a look of defiance. It was the look of a mountain watching a pebble. It was the language of silence, used as a threat. Min-ho flinched, a microscopic hesitation in his step as he sensed the unnatural stillness of the man at the table. He couldn't place the danger, but his lizard brain recognized the presence of a superior predator. He scoffed, trying to reclaim his bravado, and spat on the floor before swaggering out the door with his crew. The silence that followed their departure was heavy and suffocating. Emily didn't move for a long time. She stood behind the counter, her eyes fixed on the spot where Min-ho had been standing. Then, slowly, she let out a breath that sounded like a sob, though her eyes remained dry. She picked up a rag and began to wipe the counter, her movements frantic and repetitive. Ki-tae stood up. He walked to the counter, his cracked boots quiet on the linoleum. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He simply reached out and placed his hand over hers, stopping the frantic motion of the rag. Her hand was cold, vibrating with a fine, electric tremor. "You don't have to do this alone, Emily," he said, his voice a low, melodic hum that carried the weight of a promise he wasn't yet allowed to name. She looked up at him, her dark brown eyes wide and searching. She saw the laborer in the green polo, but she also saw something else, a grounded, unyielding strength that felt like a fortress. "I've been doing everything alone for a long time, Yoon," she whispered, her brows gently raised in a look of heartbreaking honesty. "That's how you survive. You don't let people in, because people are just another transaction you can't afford." "Isolation isn't a hole to fall into, Emily," Ki-tae replied, repeating the lesson he was only just beginning to learn himself. "It's a foundation. But even a foundation needs a wall to protect it." He stayed with her until the sun went down, helping her lock the heavy deadbolts and walk to her dented white Toyota. He watched her drive away, the taillights disappearing into the November gloom, and then he turned back toward the shadows of the district. The $8 Casio watch on his wrist ticked with a relentless, mechanical precision, counting down the time he had left as a ghost. The scavengers thought they were hunting a forgotten girl in a failing cafe. They didn't realize they had wandered into the territory of a dragon who was tired of being invisible. Ki-tae felt the cold rain begin to fall again, soaking into his hoodie, but he didn't feel like a speck anymore. He felt like a storm. He had 30 days left in his experiment, but as he walked toward the bus stop, his jaw set in a hatchet-like line. Yoon Ki-tae knew the experiment was already over. He couldn't stay invisible if it meant letting the world break the only person who had ever truly seen him. The scavenger had made a fatal mistake. He had tried to burn the only home a monster had ever known. The aftermath of the scavenger's visit left the Madison Cup feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a besieged outpost, the fluorescent hum overhead sounding sharper, more brittle, as if the glass tubes themselves were vibrating with the threat of the coming storm. Yoon Ki-tae stayed long after his lukewarm coffee had turned to sludge, watching Emily move. She was scrubbing the same 4 inches of laminate counter with a rhythmic, desperate intensity, her dark red sweater bunching at the shoulders. She wasn't crying, but her silence was heavier than any sob, a localized gravity that pulled the light out of the room. Ki-tae watched her from the shadows of his corner table, his large frame anchored in a chair that felt like a doll's toy, and felt the familiar, lethal coldness of the Mafia boss warring with the strange, raw ache of the man called Yoon. "Emily," he said softly, his voice a low, melodic vibration that finally cut through the frantic scratching of her rag. "The counter is clean. You're going to rub the finish right off the wood." She stopped, her hand frozen mid-swipe. She didn't look up immediately. She stood there, her head bowed, the long strands of her damp hair obscuring her face. When she finally turned toward him, her wide, dark brown eyes were glazed with a fatigue that went deeper than a long shift. It was the exhaustion of a woman who had spent her entire life bracing for a blow that always eventually landed. "They won't stop, Yoon," she whispered, her voice a thin thread of glass. "Men like Minho, they don't see a business. They see a carcass. They see a girl who doesn't have a father, a brother, or a husband to stand in the doorway, and they start sharpening their knives. I've spent 4 years building Reed Bridge. I've spent every dime I have on books and heaters and coffee that people can actually afford. And now I'm just waiting for the match to drop." Ki-tae stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate, designed to keep the laborer mask intact while his internal architecture screamed for the violence he was built for. He walked behind the counter, a space he had no right to occupy, and took the rag from her hand. Her fingers were ice cold, vibrating with a fine, electric tremor that made his jaw tighten until the bone felt like it might snap. He set the rag aside and reached for 2 fresh paper cups, filling them with the cheap, scorched coffee that had become the scent of his new reality. "Sit," he commanded, not with the bark of a boss, but with the steady grounding of a man who knew how to weather a siege. They sat on the front steps of the café, tucked under the narrow metal awning as the November sky finally broke. The rain didn't just fall, it arrived in sheets of gray iron, drumming against the pavement with a deafening, percussive roar. The district blurred into a smear of wet concrete and flickering streetlights, isolating them in a small, square world of falling water and rising steam. "Gas station beans," Emily said, taking a sip and letting out a jagged, hollow laugh. 79 cents. "It's the only thing in my life that doesn't feel like a lie right now." Ki-tae watched the steam from his cup vanish into the damp air. "Why do you stay, Emily? You're smart. You're capable. You could go to Gangnam or Midtown. You could work for a corporation that provides health insurance and a door that locks properly. Why stay in a box that smells like burnt coffee and damp cardboard?" Emily leaned her head back against the brick wall, her eyes closing as the spray from the rain misted her face. "Because for some of us, Yoon, invisibility isn't a choice we make in a penthouse. It's a state of being. If I go to a corporate office, I'm just the overweight girl in the cubicle that people talk over. I'm the one who gets skipped for promotions and ignored at the Christmas party. But here, in this failing, beautiful mess, the kids see me. The old ladies on Bergen Avenue see me. When I put a book in a 6-year-old's hand, I'm not a speck. I'm the person who gave them a world." She opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him, with an unshielded sincerity that made Ki-tae feel more exposed than if he were standing naked in the rain. "You stay, too," she noted. You've got hands that look like they've seen 1,000 fights, and a gaze that makes even Minho flinch, yet you're mopping floors at Fresh Mart for minimum wage. You're hiding, Yoon. I don't know what you're hiding from, and I won't ask. But I know that you're the first person in 10 years who has sat on a wet curb with me without asking for a transaction in return. At that moment, Ki-tae felt the mausoleum of gold crumble entirely. He had spent his adult life surrounded by the most beautiful, curated women in the country, women like Sora, whose every word was a calculated move on a chessboard. He had been looking for a test to see if anyone could love the shell of a man, but sitting here in the cold, smelling the pilling wool of Emily's red sweater and the cheap bitterness of the coffee, he realized he was the one who was failing. She wasn't a test. She was the most remarkable person he had ever met. She was a woman who had been salted by deception and bruised by the world's casual cruelty, yet she chose to build a home made of rain for everyone else. She didn't have his $900 million, his army of soldiers, or his name that made judges sweat, yet she possessed a sovereign authority over her own soul that he had never achieved. She lived in a reality that was stubbornly real, while he had spent his life playing with shadows. "I'm not hiding," Ki-tae said, his voice dropping into a register that was dangerously honest. "I was just lost. I thought the only way to be seen was to stand on top of a mountain. I didn't realize that the only view worth having is the one from the ground, next to someone who doesn't care about the mountain." Emily smiled then, a small, tired, beautiful thing that did something to the air temperature between them. She reached out and brushed a stray drop of rain from the sleeve of his hoodie, her touch light but grounding. "It's a good view, Yoon. A bit wet, but good." They sat in silence as the $8 Casio watch on Ki-tae's wrist ticked toward evening. The moral of the dragon was becoming clear to him now. Isolation wasn't a hole to fall into. It was the only place where the noise of the world stopped long enough for you to hear the truth. The truth was that he was falling for this woman with a force that terrified him. Not because of a test, and not because of a lie, but because she was the first person who had ever offered him respect without an invoice attached. But the silence was also a countdown. Minho and the scavengers were coming back on Monday. The world of transactions was demanding payment, and the invisible laborer didn't have the currency to stop them. Ki-tae looked at Emily's profile, the soft, round facial features, the damp hair, the dark red sweater that was her only armor, and he knew what he had to do. He would have to reclaim his throne. He would have to become the monster again to protect the person who had made him feel like a man. He would have to risk the 90-second truth of their relationship by revealing the $900 million lie. "Emily," he said, standing up as the rain began to taper into a mist. "Don't worry about Monday. The world thinks you're alone, but they're wrong. Some specks are actually the eye of a storm." She looked up at him, her brows gently raised in confusion, but she didn't question him. She simply nodded, trusting the man she thought she knew. As she walked to her dented white Toyota, Ki-tae stood on the steps of the Madison Cup and watched her go. He didn't feel like a ghost anymore. He felt like a guardian. The experiment was over. The governance had begun. He would give her the world, even if it meant he had to lose his place in hers. The district was a landscape of jagged edges and half-light, a place where the city seemed to have run out of both money and ambition. Yoon Ki-tae stood at the window of his studio apartment, watching the rain strike the glass with a percussive, metallic rhythm. The $8 Casio watch on his wrist was a constant, ticking presence, a humble digital heartbeat in a room that smelled of damp plaster and the metallic tang of the rusted sink. In his previous life, isolation had been a fortress, a curated, expensive distance he maintained from the world to protect the quiet arithmetic of his power. He had lived behind bulletproof glass and triple-encrypted firewalls, believing that true strength was the ability to be unreachable. But as he watched the streetlights flicker over the cracked pavement of Bergen Avenue, Ki-tae realized he had been wrong. He hadn't been powerful, he had only been insulated. The moral of the dragon was not about the hoard of gold or the fire in the belly. It was about the sovereignty of the soul when the hoard was gone. He had spent his adult life in a mausoleum of wealth, surrounded by people like Hannah, Minji, and Sora, women whose every gesture was a managed performance, a calculation of his net worth. He had believed that love and loyalty were commodities, transactions that could be gamed if you were smart enough or ruthless enough. But Emily Maddison had dismantled that theory in 90 seconds of reign. She didn't have a billion-dollar merger to offer him. She didn't have a pedigree or a social circle that could advance his interests. What she had was a stubborn reality, a way of being that was so grounded, so profoundly honest, that it made his entire empire look like a house of cards. He thought about the way Emily moved through the world. She was heavy, she was underfunded, and she was exhausted, yet she occupied her space with an unyielding clarity. When the scavengers had entered her cafe, she hadn't looked for a man to hide behind. She had stood her ground, her red sweater a vibrant, defiant flag against the gray rot of the neighborhood. Her strength wasn't derived from a bank account or a family name. It was forged in the fire of being ignored. She had learned the hard lesson that the world would always try to look through her, and instead of shrinking, she had become dense. She had become a foundation. Ki-tae realized then that isolation is not a hole to fall into, but a foundation to build upon. For years, he had feared the not knowing, the terrifying possibility that without his money, he was nothing but a speck. But Emily proved that a speck could be the eye of a storm. She lived in a world where things were exactly what they were. A cracked radiator hose was a cracked hose, a burnt coffee bean was a burnt bean, and a kindness from a stranger was a kindness. There was no subtext in her world, no recording devices taped under the table, no federal agents in wait. There was only the truth of the moment. And that truth was more lethal to a man of his background than any bullet. He looked at his hands, the skin rough from the fresh mart pallets. The grime of the warehouse settled deep into the lines of his palms. He felt a strange, pressurized respect for the man he had become in these few weeks, the version of himself that didn't need a Patek Philippe to know what time it was, or a black card to prove he existed. He was learning that power was not about the ability to command others, but the ability to command oneself when no one was watching. Emily didn't need a mafia boss to protect her. She needed a man who understood that her struggle was sacred. But as the digital numbers on the Casio flickered toward midnight, the educational weight of the lesson took a darker turn. He understood now that his $900 million was a clumsy tool. It could buy a building, it could hire an army, and it could erase an enemy, but it could not buy the look of genuine concern in Emily's eyes when she saw him shivering in the rain. His billions were an abstraction. Her coffee was real. His empire was a story he told the world. Her cafe was a life she lived for others. The moral was clear. The world treats the invisible with a casual cruelty that would break most men, but for those who survive it, that invisibility becomes a superpower. Emily was untouchable because she had already survived the worst the world could do. She had been forgotten, and she had chosen to remember herself. Ki-tae had spent his life trying to be unforgettable, only to realize that being forgotten was the only way to truly be found. He turned away from the window, the shadows of the room lengthening as the storm outside intensified. He thought of the Monday deadline the scavengers had set. Minho and his crew were predators of the surface, men who thrived on the small imaginations of those who feared them. They believed that because Emily was a girl in a failing cafe, she was a carcass. They didn't understand that they were wandering into the territory of a man who had finally learned the value of the ground he stood on. "I was the ghost," Ki-tae whispered to the empty room, his voice a low, melodic hum that carried the weight of a death warrant. "But she is the one who brought me back to life." He realized that his attachment dysfunction, the calcified belief that he was only worth what he could provide, was a lie he had told himself to stay safe. Emily didn't want what he could provide. She wanted him to stay. She wanted the man who sat on the wet curb, the one who didn't ask for a transaction in return. And that realization was the most terrifying thing he had ever encountered. It meant he had to be real. It meant he had to be vulnerable. It meant that the moral of the dragon was not about winning the war, but about being worthy of the peace that followed. He reached for his black hoodie, the fabric damp and smelling of wood smoke and rain. He had to prepare. Not for a merger, not for a hit, but for a defense of the only home made of rain he had ever known. He would use his billions, yes, but he would use them as a shadow, a silent guardian that ensured Emily's reality remained unbroken. He would become the storm that surrounded her sanctuary, but he would do it with the quiet, clinical precision he had learned from her. As he stepped out into the flickering hallway, the $8 watch ticked with a relentless, mechanical certainty. He was no longer a mafia boss pretending to be poor. He was a man who had discovered that the only power worth having was the power to protect the truth. The scavengers were coming for a girl, but they were going to find a legend. And Yoon Ki-tae, the man who had been buried in gold, was finally ready to walk into the light. The lesson was over. The governance had begun. And the world was about to find out what happens when the ghost finally decides to become the storm. The Monday deadline arrived with a sky that had been scoured into a bruised, airless purple, the kind of evening where the wind tasted of iron and the city felt like it was holding its breath. Inside the Madison Cup, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of scorched coffee and the mounting static of a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. Emily was moving with a mechanical, brittle precision, her fingers trembling slightly as she wiped the same 4 inches of laminate counter for the 10th time. She was wearing the dark red sweater again, the pilling wool a soft, domestic shield against a world that was rapidly turning cold. Yoon Ki-tae sat at his corner table, his large frame compressed into the fragile wooden chair, his $8 Casio watch ticking a relentless, digital countdown against his wrist. He looked like Yoon, the invisible laborer in the black hoodie, but beneath the fraying hem and the light stubble, the mausoleum of gold was opening its heavy stone doors. The bell above the door didn't chime. It shrieked. Min-ho stepped inside, followed by his 2 subordinates, their shadows stretching long and jagged across the scuffed linoleum. The scavengers were no longer performing a saunter. They were marching. Min-ho looked twitchy, his bleached blonde hair damp from the mist, his eyes wide with a manic, unearned authority. He didn't look at the reading corner or the kids' books today. He walked straight to the counter and slammed a heavy, rusted metal pipe onto the surface, the sound echoing through the cafe like a gunshot. "Time's up, Emily," Min-ho rasped, his voice a jagged edge of nasal aggression. "The sun is down, and my patience went with it. Where's the envelope?" Emily didn't flinch, though the color had drained from her face, leaving her soft features as pale as bone. She rested her hands on the counter, her knuckles white. "I told you, Min-ho. There is no envelope. There is only enough money to keep the lights on and the books in these kids' hands. If you want to steal from a community program, you'll have to do it in front of the whole neighborhood." Min-ho laughed, a dry, hollow sound that had no humor in it. He leaned over the counter, the leather of his jacket creaking. "The neighborhood doesn't see you, Emily. They don't see this box. And by tomorrow morning, there won't be a box left to see. Just a pile of ash and some melted plastic." He reached out, his hand closing around a stack of new books, the ones Ki-tae had helped her carry in the rain, and swept them onto the floor with a violent, dismissive jerk. "Last chance. Give me the money, or I start with the windows and end with your face." In the corner, Yoon Ki-tae felt the mask finally disintegrate. The transition was not a sudden explosion, but a cold, tectonic shift. The laborer vanished. The invisible man evaporated. The air in the cafe seemed to drop 10 degrees as Ki-tae stood up. He didn't scramble. He rose with the unhurried, predatory grace of a creature that had never known fear. His shoulders, previously hunched to hide his power, squared into a fortress. His jaw, shadowed by stubble, set into the hatchet-like line that had made judges in Seoul return his phone calls at 3:00 a.m., but it was his eyes that changed the most. The weary, hollowed-out gaze of the speck was gone, replaced by the color of gunmetal, a lethal, clinical gray that saw the world not as a place of struggle, but as a map of targets. "Put the pipe down, Min-ho," Ki-tae said. The voice didn't come from a laborer. It was a low, melodic hum that carried the weight of a death warrant, a sound that vibrated in the floorboards and made the 2 subordinates at the door take an involuntary step backward. Min-ho turned, his bravado flickering for a microscopic second before he forced a sneer. He looked at the man in the hoodie, the guy who usually just sat in the corner and drank cheap coffee. "Sit down, you charity case. This doesn't involve you, unless you want to spend the night in the ICU. Ki-tae didn't stop. He walked toward the counter, his cracked boots silent on the floor. Every step was a masterclass in governance, a display of absolute self-possession that made the small cafe feel like a cage. He stopped 3 feet from Minho, his presence so overwhelming that the leader of the scavengers actually stumbled back against the counter. "You're a scavenger, Minho," Ki-tae said, his voice dropping into a register that made Emily gasp. "You pick at the edges of things you didn't build because you're too small to create anything of your own. You think this girl is a carcass. You think this cafe is a target." He stepped closer, entering Minho's personal space with a terrifying stillness. "But you've wandered into the wrong territory, and you've touched the only thing in this city that I've decided belongs to the light. Who the hell do you think you are?" Minho shrieked, swinging the metal pipe in a desperate, wide arc. Ki-tae didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to move until the pipe was inches from his temple. Then, with a blur of motion that was too fast for the human eye to track, he caught the pipe in his left hand. The sound of the impact was a dull, meaty thud, but Ki-tae's arm didn't move an inch. He held the pipe with the casual strength of a man holding a pencil. He looked directly into Minho's eyes, and for the first time, the scavenger saw the monster. He saw the neck tattoo, the scars of 1,000 high-stakes betrayals, and the gunmetal eyes that had presided over the concrete foundations of the Seoul Incheon Bridge. Minho's pupils dilated, his breath hitched in a ragged, animal sob. He realized, with a soul-crushing clarity, that he wasn't looking at a laborer. He was looking at a legend. "I and the storm you were worried about," Ki-tae whispered. With a sickening crack, Ki-tae twisted the metal pipe out of Minho's grip, the torque alone snapping the scavenger's wrist. Minho screamed, a high, thin sound of absolute terror, as he collapsed to his knees. Ki-tae didn't strike him. He didn't need to. He simply stood over him, the pipe resting lightly in his hand, his gaze as cold and indifferent as the mountain watching a pebble. The 2 subordinates at the door didn't wait for instructions. They turned and bolted into the night, their footsteps fading into the distance. Ki-tae looked down at Minho, who was clutching his broken wrist, his face a mask of snot and tears. "You will leave this district. You will never speak Emily's name. You will never look at this cafe again. If I even see your shadow on Bergen Avenue, I won't send a soldier. I will come for you myself. Do you understand?" Minho nodded frantically, his head bobbing like a broken toy.
"Get out."
The scavenger scrambled toward the door, tripping over his own feet in his haste to escape the gravity of the man in the corner. When the bell finally chimed again, the cafe was left in a silence, so profound it felt like the world had been hollowed out. Ki-tae stood in the center of the room, the metal pipe still in his hand. The adrenaline was a cold, familiar hum in his veins, but as he turned toward the counter, he felt the first true wave of fear he had known in weeks. He looked at Emily. She was standing frozen, her hands still resting on the laminate surface, her dark brown eyes wide with a shock that was slowly turning into something else. She wasn't looking at Yoon. She was looking at the man who had just dismantled a predator without breaking a sweat. She was looking at the monster he had tried so hard to hide. "Yoon," she whispered, the name sounding like a question she no longer knew the answer to. Ki-tae looked at his hands, the large, scarred hands that were now clutching a weapon. He looked at the $8 Casio watch, its plastic strap a ridiculous contrast to the lethal authority he had just displayed. The 90-second truth was gone. The home made of rain was compromised. He had saved the cafe, but he had lost the invisibility that had allowed him to be her peer. "I told you, Emily," he said, his voice returning to that low, melodic vibration, but now it was tinged with a heartbreaking sadness. "Isolation isn't a hole. It's a foundation. I just forgot to tell you how deep the foundation goes." He set the pipe on the counter and turned toward the door, his jaw set in a hatchet-like line. The moral of the dragon was complete. He had become the storm to protect the light, and now he had to walk back into the dark to ensure it stayed that way. The silence that followed the scavenger's retreat was not the peaceful quiet of a resolved conflict, but the heavy, pressurized stillness of a tomb. Yoon Ki-tae stood in the center of the Maddison cup, his knuckles still white from the torque he'd used to snap Minho's wrist, the metal pipe discarded on the laminate counter like a piece of industrial waste. He didn't look like a laborer anymore. The black zip-up hoodie couldn't hide the fortress of his shoulders, and the $8 Casio watch on his wrist looked like a child's toy against the lethal authority radiating from his every pore. He turned slowly toward Emily, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt his own heart hammer against his ribs, not with the adrenaline of violence, but with the cold, hollow terror of a man about to lose the only thing that made him feel real. Emily was still standing behind the counter, her hands flat against the surface. Her dark brown eyes were wide, tracing the line of his jaw and the jagged, gunmetal focus of his gaze as if she were seeing him for the first time. And in a way, she was. She looked at the pilling red wool of her own sweater, then back at the man who had just dismantled a predator with the clinical efficiency of a machine. "Who are you, Yoon?" she whispered. The name sounded like a ghost in the room, a word that no longer fit the man standing before her. "Because I just saw a man who doesn't exist on Bergen Avenue. I saw someone who has looked into the dark so long, he doesn't even blink when it looks back." Ki-tae didn't move. He knew the 90-second truth of their meeting in the rain was dying. He knew that the mausoleum of gold was about to open its doors and swallow this tiny, fluorescent-lit sanctuary whole. He reached up and pulled back the hood of his sweatshirt, finally letting the light hit the full extent of the dragon ink tattoo that climbed his neck, the mark of the chairman, the architect of the city's shadows. "My name is Yoon Ki-tae," he said. His voice was no longer the soft, melodic thread of a laborer. It was a low, resonant hum that carried the weight of $900 million and 1,000 buried secrets. "I am the man who owns the ports you see from the highway. I am the name that makes the people who scare you wake up in a cold sweat. And for the last 8 weeks, I have been a liar." He walked toward her, and for the first time, Emily took a half step back.
The movement was a blade to his chest.
He stopped immediately, keeping the counter between them, a physical barrier to match the psychological chasm he had just opened. "I built a theory about myself, Emily," he continued, his eyes locked onto hers with a desperate, gunmetal intensity. "I believed that love was a transaction. I believed that every smile I ever received was an invoice, and every touch was a contract. I'd been betrayed by women who loved my wallet and attorneys who loved my secrets. So I stripped it all away. I became Yoon to see if anyone would choose the man without the money. I was rigging the test, trying to find a version of reality that I could control." Emily let out a jagged, hollow breath.
A test.
"So that's what this was? I was a proof of concept? A variable in your little experiment to see if the overweight girl in the cafe was desperate enough to love a ghost." Her voice rose, a sharp edge of hurt cutting through the shock. "You sat on that wet curb. You drank that 79-cent coffee. You listened to me talk about my father leaving and the kids I'm trying to save, and all the while, you were just waiting to see if I'd pass." "No," Ki-tae said, and the word was a plea. "The test failed the moment I met you. I came here to see if I was worth loving, but I stayed because I realized you were the only thing in this city worth protecting. I lied about my name, Emily. I lied about the apartment and the job at Freshmart. But the staying, that was the only real thing I have ever done." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, platinum keycard, the symbol of the penthouse, the empire, the mausoleum. He set it on the counter next to the discarded metal pipe. "The scavengers are gone. I've already had my associates buy the debt on this building and the 3 blocks surrounding it. It's a trust now in your name. Rebridge is funded for the next 50 years. You never have to worry about a kitchen fire or a broken window again. You are sovereign here." Emily looked at the keycard, then back at him. She didn't look impressed. She didn't look like a woman who had just been handed a fortune. She looked like a woman whose home made of rain had been invaded by a storm she didn't ask for. "You think you can fix a lie with a checkbook, Ki-tae?" she asked, using his full name for the first time. It sounded like a sentence. "You think because you bought the building, you bought the honesty we had on those steps? You told me isolation wasn't a hole, but a foundation. But your foundation is built on salted earth. You didn't trust me enough to be real, and you didn't trust yourself enough to believe I could handle the truth." "I was afraid," Ki-tae admitted, the confession feeling like a physical weight being lifted. I was a dragon who had forgotten how to be a man. I thought if you saw the monster, you'd look away, just like the rest of the world looks away from you. I thought we were the same, two invisible people hiding in the margins. We aren't the same, Emily said, her voice dropping into a register of profound, stubborn reality. I'm invisible because the world is small. You're invisible because you're a coward. You hid behind a hoodie because you didn't want to be a transaction, but you turned our entire friendship into the biggest transaction of all. She walked around the counter, stopping inches from him. She was shorter than him, her soft features flushed, her dark red sweater a vibrant contrast to the cold gray of his hoodie. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the Casio watch on his wrist. This watch is a lie, she whispered. But the way you held my hand when Minho was here, the way you looked at those kids like they were the only things that mattered, was that a lie too? No, Ki-tae said, his voice cracking. That was the only part of me that was alive. Emily looked at him for a long, agonizing minute. The silence in the cafe was no longer a tomb, it was a crossroads. She saw the Mafia boss, the billionaire, and the monster, but she also saw the man who had sat on a wet curb for 90 seconds just to make sure she wasn't alone. I don't want your penthouse, Ki-tae, she said finally. And I don't want your merger or your soldiers. I want the man who stays. If you want to be in my world, you don't do it as a ghost or a storm. You do it as a person, stubborn, real, and honest.
Can you do that?
Or is the dragon too afraid to be seen in the light? Ki-tae looked at her, and the calcified certainty of his past life finally shattered. He didn't have a contract to offer her, and he didn't have a transaction to game. He only had this stubborn reality of the woman in the red sweater. I'll stay, he promised, his gunmetal eyes finally softening into something warm and human. For as long as you'll have me. No more tests. No more masks. He reached out and took her hand, his rough, scarred palm meeting her soft, steady one. The $8 watch ticked against his wrist, a humble, relentless reminder that while his name was Yoon Ki-tae, the man who had found love in a failing cafe was simply a man who had decided to stop running. The ghost had become the storm, but the storm had finally found its home. Power can build a mausoleum, but only honesty can build a home. Yoon Ki-tae learned that the most valuable thing an empire can offer is the freedom to finally be seen, not for what you have, but for the truth of who you are when the gold is stripped away.